seconds, I'll know that everything's working fine, and then we can focus on getting ready to actually do the thing. But it's time to do the thing. I think we're
Time
good.
to do the thing.
Yep. Um, Figure out what the thing is and then do that. That's the emphasis of the hour. But right now, we're going to be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. It's great to have Terry's thorn in the flesh with us. Edwin, how are you doing?
I'm feeling thorny.
Yeah, of course
Feeling
you are.
No, 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 no.
This is going to be great.
Oh, boy.
This is the
Usually it's
best
me that crosses
day
the line. I mean, what is
ever.
up with this?
Best day. Best
Oh,
day.
well, that was not meant to be crossing the line. I did not even
Best
think
ever.
about that. I am really sorry
super
about
pleased.
that. I'm very
Super
sorry
pleased.
about that.
This is recorded for future use.
Yes!
Oh, boy.
That just gave me license to do and say anything today, basically, and I'm still better than Edwin. That's what's so beautiful about this.
Is that different
Wow.
than any other day?
I'm so
I
glad
think
I invited Edwin on the program.
I'm having trouble with my connection. I think I'm.
So
Phil,
I'm gonna
what
change my
question were you going to ask today?
Well, I'm going to change it now. Here's the question to think about that I want to ask, but we won't have to answer. Have you ever gone back and edited the audio from a sermon?
Yes. Not a sermon, closing announcements. Edwin knows all about that story. Who's on here?
I have never done that.
I have done that.
You know why Edwin's never done that is because he doesn't have the capability to know how to splice and edit the film to begin with. He has people that do that for him.
The question was not why. The question was, have you ever done that?
Yeah.
He has people.
The delete button has been utilized. The destruction of the physical tapes has been utilized.
What I just learned this morning is we need one of those delay buttons like they have with live radio.
Let me. It's top of the hour, so we'll have to save our questions for future use. But I will say this: in concert with Mark Russell, obviously, making announcements to me is more nerve-wracking than any sermon, any Bible class, period. Because I am always
are the worst.
Right.
By the way,
how I feel about that, unless they actually regularly speak publicly.
Mark's comment, though, is specifically tied to a specific day of post-sermon announcing by a song leader that was, let's just say, impromptu speaking, and it has been edited off of the YouTube video.
We'll talk about that one later.
I'm pretty sure you know this story, Phil. I can't believe I haven't told you that.
I may. I'm just kind of trying to maintain the solid, straight,
So 2 Corinthians 12.
Yeah, 2 Corinthians 12. Speaking of thorns in the flesh.
Yeah. Why don't we do this? Before we get into the text itself, we'll read from 2 Corinthians chapter 12 in just a second. But let's walk ourselves to where we're at. We've looked at the bulk of the Corinthian correspondence as published to us in the remaining manuscripts. We are obviously missing half of this dialogue back and forth in some ways, at least. But we're also nearing the culmination of this look in the text. We've covered a number of important segments, and Paul is starting to reach maybe his culmination or mountaintop kind of pontification phase, where he's really trying to drive home key messages. And so before we read any from chapter 12, do either of you have something important that will help frame your picture of the text as we go forward?
Seems to me that... go ahead, Terry.
Go ahead, Evan. No, go ahead. Guest first.
2 Corinthians is Paul's defense. As often, it seems to me, as often happened, Paul would go into a community, he would teach, he would preach, he would have impact. And he had done that a couple of times at Corinth, had varying degree of reaction and response, but it does appear that after a painful visit, there had been some repentance from the Corinthians. Their relationship was better. And now there's some false apostles that have come in behind Paul and are taking some of the folks away from his influence. And so this is his defense. As Galatians was his defense against Judaizing teachers, this is his defense against these false apostles.
Yeah,
and we're finally getting that culmination.
Yeah, he's been doing that. He did that up to about chapter 7. He took a little break to talk about the giving of graces. The 3 graces, as Phil kind of harped on in those sections. And then starting back in chapter 10, he went back to this. And, of course, in chapter 11, he's going to end the book this way. Chapter 11 is when he lists that laundry list of all the things that he suffered as proof of his apostleship. And it's interesting, one of the more interesting things we'll see here is there's this sarcastic jab at these other teachers today where he calls them super apostles, which I think is pretty interesting as well. So yeah, he's in the heart of the defense, which is interesting because he's already gone there twice, and this is probably at least his 3rd letter, right? So when you think about all the interaction that he had with him, you would think of all people that did not need to defend himself, it would be Paul, and yet he has spent himself, I think there's I can't remember, it's close to 10 times he uses this language of having to commend himself because of the charges that these super apostles are making. And really today, I think, from the jump in chapter 12, this is where he really perhaps is kind of the apex moment of this book and what he's saying to them. So it's pretty rich in this chapter, in this idea of defense.
One other thing I guess I would add, I've been influenced by Ben Witherington's commentary on this chapter, and I think I buy the approach that Paul is speaking throughout 11 and 12 very tongue-in-cheek, that he's using what might be called the fool's speech or the fool's defense. So picturing himself as a fool. You know how sometimes debaters today will say things like, well, I'm not smart and intelligent like you are, and I'm not, I'm just a 6th grade graduate, and all I can do is just read the Bible. And it's somewhat kind of like that approach to his defense. And I think I see a lot of that in these chapters.
Kind of like that famous sermon which kept referencing an AA degree, and he might talk over people's heads. So.
No, that guy was just an idiot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say it this way. I do agree with Edwin there that this is a variation of the big basket of wise fools. You have the wise fool narratives that occur in the Old Testament. Here we have someone who presents themselves as a fool, but nobody's buying that he's a fool. Like, we all know this is not who he really is. And they're all similar rhetorical plays to kind of make an argument stick deeper. And I think there's a lot of sense to that, even though the way in which Paul employs that conversational tool leverages on the reality of a circumstance. Like, he's not pulling these things out of whole cloth. These are things that the rest of the story of Paul, the rest of Paul's narrative events in the New Testament really match up to a lot of his experiences. And so he's able to pull it even deeper there. Let's start, though, by reading, say, verses 1 through 6. We'll save 7 through 10 so Edwin can read those, even though it also contains one of my favorite sections of the text. Edwin gets it. But Terry, would you read verses 1 through 6 for us?
Sure. So verse 1, I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the 3rd heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man I will boast. But on my own behalf I will not boast, except of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me.
So I think this also kind of ties in very specifically to that language tool. This is him setting it up and kind of getting to the point where he wants to drive home his big point, which is verses 7 through 10. But what do you guys see here? Starting maybe even just in verses 1 through 5, and then we'll look at verse 6 as an independent set. What do you guys see in verses 1 through 5 that are important for us to understand what Paul is teaching, important for those who are listening, and what are some of the applications that believers today need to take away from the text?
Paul is, again, doing this I had not heard of that basket of fools that you used earlier, but this fool's defense, he's presenting himself as a fool, and yet getting in the little point that says, I'm not as foolish as this speech might make you think. After all, I have received revelation from God. It's reminiscent of the last verse of 1 Corinthians 7, after he's gone through all of this, and he said that he's giving them what he's saying rather than what the Lord had said. But then he ends with, and I think I too have the Spirit of God. So it's that little dig. It's kind of like with Philemon, when he says to Philemon, I can tell you to do this. I could tell you to do this, but I'm not going to tell you to do this. I'm going to plead with you. But what he just did was tell Philemon to do this. It's that rhetorical structure. And so Paul is using that here as he is demonstrating to his audience, guys, I'm not just talking out of my mind and out of my head. I have received revelations. I have received visions. When he wrote his Galatian letter, he talked about his the revelation of Jesus Christ that he had on the road to Damascus. I believe that's what he's referring to in Ephesians when he talks about, I wrote before about how I received the mystery in brief. And now he brings that up again to remind the Corinthians, I don't know what these other false apostles have, but I have revelation from the Lord. And I guess the final thing there is how that mirrors Moses when Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, when Aaron and Miriam kind of pushed back against Moses, and God pointed out, hey, with some prophets, I give visions, I give dreams, I talk to them in certain ways, but I talk to Moses face to face. And Paul is bringing himself up to that level under this new covenant. I have, whether in the body or out of the body, I have been in the presence of God. I have heard the word of God. I should have more influence with you than any of these other people do.
Yeah, I may take the timing of this a little differently just because the 14 years ago doesn't seem to match up with his conversion story.
Oh, I'm not saying this is the conversion.
Yeah.
I'm saying this is similar to him bringing that up in Galatians.
Yeah, it's similar, but this is another time, which makes this more interesting. And that's what I wanted to point out was this is something that happened. It looks like timing between the first and second missionary journeys, possibly in that kind of time window. What makes that interesting is the only time this has been heard of. Like Paul's never referred to this idea. To me, it's similar to the Roman citizenship, where Paul just kind of held that in his pocket until necessary, and then pulled it out and said, "Oh yeah, I'm going to go to Rome because I'm a Roman citizen. I appeal to Caesar." And here, it's like the appropriate time. And I love the way it starts off. Like, hey, look, I could go on boasting, but I think I'll move on to Revelations. By the way, 14 years ago, I was called up to the third heaven. It's almost as if he's saying to these guys that claiming to be better than him, all right. It's kind of like when, by the way, when you're playing a game of horse, and I know Edwin knows not what that is, but that's a basketball game, Edwin. He's not into sports ball.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And you make the shot, and I know Phil knows because his son plays basketball, and he's probably done this, and you kind of look at your kid like I do and go, all right, let's see if you can do that, right? It's almost as if he's saying, hey, look, okay, you want to talk about Revelations? I've gone up to third heaven. Can you top that? Where's that at? I see that it's still in that same concept of the basket of fools kind of thing, but this idea of, hey, look, this almost, and not one-upmanship, just really Paul defending himself and saying, yeah, okay, you've got this, here's what I got. And it's just pretty interesting to kind of see that, which, oh, by the way, I don't think I've always made this connection. This whole thing of the third heaven and this revelation he receives does set up 7 through 10, right? It kind of explains why 7 through 10 is even necessary.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the part that I think I've not always made the connection to. But Paul, what you see here is Paul saying, I've received greater revelation than you guys. And yet you want to criticize me. I mean, that's what's going on here. I do think it's interesting, by the way, that he speaks in third person. I think that's, which I always get entertained when anybody speaks in third person about themselves for some reason. But going back to Jerry Maguire, still, I just think that's hilarious, the third person kind of references as well.
Yeah, I think there's some setup there because you'll note, you talked about he's not trying to top himself, and yet he starts with minimal illustrations of what it means to be an apostle to the maximum physical illustration of being an apostle, human suffering, to now going into the spiritual realm and the unseen realm of what it means to be an apostle. And they are all continuing this challenge to the super apostles, the false apostles that would be in the context of the Corinthians, saying, all right, let's keep pace. But let's take a look at these things. And he's keeping pace from this perspective of he's just a fool. He's just Paul, just little old Paul. Like, why are you worried about little old Paul? And then he comes to this, okay, now there's this person who he's distanced himself from, that everyone knows. Like, you're reading like, come on, Paul, we know who you're talking about. We know you're not this foolish. And so
Yeah.
he's continuing to use his language to heighten the pressure. He's tightening the screws on his argument. And then when he starts boasting in his weakness, there's like more and more condensed pressure. Edwin?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in addition to this kind of I'm taking the role of a fool, I've been pushed into it, he points out. And it starts back in chapter 10, I think it was. I entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who am humble when face to face with you, but bold towards you when I am away. So he just says that as if he's saying that about himself, but we find out in verse 10 why he's saying that about himself, because that's what the opponents were saying about him. And so
Right.
this adoption of this rhetorical device of being the fool is because his opponents, that this is the accusation they've made of him. And so now he's going to, okay, I'll take the role of the fool. By the time it's done, you look at that and say, well, that didn't sound like a fool to me.
Yeah, it's that trash talking idea of, oh yeah, I'm a fool. I've been to the third heaven. I've got a revelation, but I'm the fool here. That's kind of what's going on in that whole idea.
Yeah, and as that moves forward, you get to verse 6, which is a bit of the transition into the next clause in the text, when he says, okay, though if I would wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. So he's calling back all the way to the beginning of this dialogue. It's like, I don't really want you to think more of me than you ought to. I want you to listen to truth. And so this is the setup is now having this resolution.
Doesn't that even harken back to the first letter where he talks about not speaking certain ways so that they could see Jesus, right? So they could see the word, see the truth. I mean, it's interesting to see those connections here. Look, I don't want to do this because I want you to see the gospel instead of me. That's why I'm taking this approach, which is, by the way, also a direct contrast to the, quote, super apostles he'll label later, who all they wanted was the Corinthians to see them, which is why they've gone after Paul as the fool. So there's quite a contrast, which then ties back to the I'm just being humble kind of approach that was mentioned earlier.
All right, Edwin, you're up. You ready to read?
Sure, absolutely. You want me to read?
It's your moment to shine. 7 is as much as you want to follow afterwards.
All right. So, to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Yeah, so this whole wordplay that Paul is employing here is one of my New Testament favorite texts. I don't know if it's my favorite, but it lives in the space of ones that quickly come to mind when I think which one is a gold text. Like, this is where I want to be spiritually. I want to be at a point where this is where I'm living in my day-to-day life. But what do you guys see here? I know Edmund's probably got a lot poised to drop to us, but again, those same questions. What does this mean for Paul? What does it mean for the Christians in the first century? And what does it mean for us?
Well, for Paul, it means that he's following in the footsteps of Jesus. He pleads 3 times. Does that sound familiar? He is asking 3 times for the thorn, the piece of wood, if you will, to be removed, just as Jesus asked 3 times for the cross. And just as Jesus was told no, Paul has been told no. So for Paul, it's that walking in the footsteps of Jesus. When I'm really living like Jesus, I experience what Jesus experienced. For the Corinthians, there's not only the aspect of we should expect this from the Lord's apostle because this is what the Lord went through, but there's the idea that probably the thorn in the flesh had been one of the things that the opponents had highlighted. Really? You think this is God's man? If he was God's man, do you think he would really have this problem going on, whatever the problem was? And so Paul is giving his defense. Well, of course, because that's what Jesus went through. God has always used people in these situations. And for us, I think probably the great application is just in when I'm trying to be strong all on my own, when I think the way to do this Christian walk is I've got to prove myself and I've got to be the one who doesn't need help, who comes to God and says, look at how amazing I am. Well, I'm doing it wrong.
Yeah. I'll add this. I think there are 3 characters you can put into this setting too. You've got Jesus, you've got Paul, and then you can put Peter. Gospel of Luke chapter 22, Jesus says to Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And so I think there's a structure that's being sent there, and that comes off the conversation where Judas is identified as the very one who will deny him. There's some structure there, but then Peter's denial follows on the heels of Judas's denial, but they're 2 different things. And then Paul then serves as the counterpart to us that comes around and says, I'm appealing to God 3 times in the same kind of structural, be with Jesus and be like Jesus. You get this whole package picture that can challenge us at any of the points that we might be living on right now, whether we feel like we're Peter and we're ready to pull the sword, whether we're like Judas and we're clinging to the money bag, knowing that Jesus keeps getting out of the messes he goes in, so it doesn't matter if I steal from the money bag. Or you're like Paul and you're suffering and you're like, boom, I want it. I want it. But this thorn seems to be holding me back, and God comes back and says, it's not the thorn. Look somewhere else. Terry?
Well, go ahead.
Oh, Edwin, go ahead too.
No, go ahead, Edwin.
So I think one of the other things here is that recognition of my grace is sufficient for you. The things that I'm letting happen to you, that's what you need. It may not feel like it right now. But what I'm letting you go through is what you need. And so just trust that. Put your trust in me, God is saying. If this really was bad for you, I'd take it away. And so then there's that defense again. This is helping me, Corinthians. This is helping you. This is not a reason to be ashamed of me. In fact, let's look at all my weaknesses, because what I'm writing to you is really about someone else. It's not about me.
Yeah, I also see parallels to Job, just real quickly, just because Job's this man of faith who goes through this trial, and his friend's response to that trial are, well, you must not be faithful. There's got to be something wrong with you, Job, which is not true. And these accusers in Corinth are doing the same thing with Paul. Look at all this stuff happening to Paul. Something's got to be wrong with Paul. He can't be an apostle because look what's happening to him. I think it's funny. We read Job and we look at those 3 friends and we always look down upon them. How could they think this? And the reality is not just Paul was treated that way. We do the same thing today. We look at people who go through this stuff and go, well, man, there must be some kind of problem with their relationship with God. Like they must not be as faithful. God's chastising them, which, look, the reality is, sure, you can suffer because of God's chastisement, but that doesn't mean that every form of suffering is because of that. I mean, there's a lot of other things that play roles in there. So I just think it's interesting to kind of see that kind of connection too, that the lesson that should have been taught hundreds of years earlier through the writing of Job still hasn't sunk in to these guys. That this kind of suffering is not a sign of your faith. And I just think that's pretty interesting. And by the way, just like God sends this thorn in a sense to Paul, he did the same thing in Job chapter 1 and 2. He even in chapter 2 says that Satan incited him against Job. I mean, he takes credit for allowing those things to happen. There's a lot of parallels between these two stories here in that sense.
I think additionally, I think I want to take that one step further. What you just said there prompted something in my mind, Terry, and I appreciate it. And that is that it's not only, hey, when I see someone in this position, they obviously must not be in a right relationship with God. They've obviously sinned. Sometimes we see somebody who is financially prosperous, whose marriage seems to be going great. They live in the nice house, and we assume God must be with them. Oh, must have done
Correct.
something right. Look at how God is blessing them. And I have no doubt that the super apostles were taking a very similar approach. And the reality is, it reminds me of Luke's assessment of the Beatitudes, his presentation of the Beatitudes. Who is blessed? the poor, mourning, starving, persecuted person who is not and by the way, that's Paul, who's not blessed. The rich, laughing, full, luxurious, easy life person. What we tend to think is God's blessing is not God's blessing. We get it exactly backwards, and we do it a lot.
So let's throw the question out there everybody wants to know, and answer that quickly. What's the thorn? Like what's the thorn? I know Edwin and I have talked a lot about that in the past, what our thoughts are. So maybe we'll throw it to you first, Phil, since you're always the question asker and the facilitator. We'll start off with you, put you on the hot seat. In your unchunking layers of baskets of answers over there to get all your idioms in one statement, what's the thorn?
Here's the thing that I could put two answers to. One, Galatians 4 verses 13 through 14.
Fence rider, by the way.
That I would hinge on. It was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first, and though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. So there is a connection that could, in some folks' eyes, put it to something you can see, something that would be impactful to the people around it. They're going to know it, they're going to see it. So it's not an invisible thing in that sense. Secondly, I love that the Bible does this. It does this a lot. It leaves mysteries unopened. And so my broader answer to that is the New Testament never specifies what it is. It gives us hints and possibilities. And I think there's a reason for that. Just like there's a reason for Genesis 1 through 5 to be incredibly unspecific into the questions of every generation. And so the reason that I come back with is the thorn of the flesh doesn't matter. What matters is that it was a thorn, it was physical, and Paul believed it was impacting his ministry. How many of us can walk closer to that mystery than whatever it actually was? If you have all my actual feelings about it, my actual feelings are it's probably something to do with his eyes or his hands that affect his ability to see or write. But that's just a generic answer to it. I think the real one is that it's supposed to be a mystery.
Edwin?
I will say ditto. Phil said what I would say.
Yeah, I think I often have leaned towards I think it may be more spiritual but something noticeable, but at the same time, I think it does not matter whatever it was. The greater point is what the effect of the thorn in the flesh was, what it did to Paul. And I think that's the bigger issue. It's not so much us trying to figure out what it is. And I think we wasted a lot of time about that, and that's why I wanted to ask it and just kind of come back to this is what's more important is that whatever it was, it taught Paul that what he needed to do was lean on the power of God. That's and on grace, and to boast in his relationship with Christ rather than in his flesh and in his identity. Which again, to get back to what I said earlier, is exactly the opposite of what these accusers are doing. They're boasting in themselves and accusing Paul, and actually accusing Paul to lift themselves up. And Paul's saying, no, in fact, this is why I have this. That's not how this is supposed to be handled. And this is a tremendous, really a charge against them as much as it is a boasting of Paul in his weakness. It's a charge against them and their attitude and their accusations in the way that he presents it here.
That moves us into the next block of the text. Starting off here in verse 11 through 13, it reads, I have been a fool. You forced me to it, for I ought to have been commended by you. For I was not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I am nothing. The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works. For in what were you less favored than the rest of the churches, except that I myself did not burden you? Forgive me this wrong. And so it hints at some dynamics in the way that the Corinthians saw themselves in relation to other churches without explicitly telling us. But his answer to it is, I didn't take wages from you, so now somehow you're less. Is the irony of his complaint. But then he gives 3 additional qualifiers to what would make him be an apostle. signs, wonders, and mighty works. So again, where does Paul see it? The Corinthians and us today.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He says, "Forgive me this wrong." It's like he's saying, "Oh, I should have taken money from you, and then we wouldn't be here." I think that's an ironic kind of thing that he throws out there. Oh, so if I had been a burden to you financially, we wouldn't be having this discussion. I'll remember that next time. And it's here where he uses this, and I just see it. I think you all do too. Is this super sarcastic thing about these super apostles? I think that's just probably the throat punch of the book here for me is when he uses that term to these accusers. He's not used that terminology that I can remember anywhere else. So that's why I think this is kind of the apex of the argument. We put all this in this context. He kind of is wrapping this up and kind of saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not like these guys over here, these super apostles, who, by the way, have none of the experiences that I have, but they're better than me. I just think that's pretty interesting in the context.
So there may be something very real going on here that doesn't fit in our culture very much. Again, we see this, and it just seems very... if a preacher said, I preach for you for free, we would think, well, this is just ridiculous that they're upset about this. However, during their honor, shame, patronage culture, the Corinthians wanted Paul to owe them. And one of the things that probably the super apostles had said was, well, Paul came in here with trickery and deceit. And rather than following our customs whereby you would be the patron and he would be submissive to you, he's taken this other approach. And there's possibly a second issue here, and I'm relying on Witherington for this. I have not done all the study that would say this, but I want to throw this out because this makes a lot of sense to me. That apparently what sophists would do sometimes is make a big deal about how they didn't receive wages, but they would send an associate who would get wages, and then they would get part of them from that person. And so, back in the section where he was talking about the contribution for Jerusalem, he had to make a very specific defense that we're going to bring another brother along because we aim for what is honorable in all of this. And the accusation may well be, okay, you came in here and didn't take money from us. We know why you keep asking for money for Jerusalem. You're going to skim off the top. And he's already made the defense. Nope, we're going to have somebody else along. So because I aim for what's honorable, not only before God, but also before you. And so there's been probably this accusation that Paul was not following their social norms and customs, and he was doing it somehow to obligate the Corinthians to him instead of reverse. And so he says, look, so really the wrong is that I did, well, look, I'm not going to take money from you because I am preaching, because I work for God. I don't work for you. God is my patron. You're not my patron. I think in a modern sense, I know of some people who have their LLCs or their nonprofit companies. And when they come do a speaking engagement, what they ask is for a donation to the ministry, so that it won't appear on their taxes as income. And then they will just take their income from the nonprofit company. And it's kind of that same deal is apparently what some of the sophists would do, where you don't pay me, you pay him, but then I act like I don't ever get paid and make a big deal out of it. And so Paul's saying, that's not what's going on here. I work for God. I don't work for you.
Yeah, I don't know if it's exclusively the LLC context, although it does hint at the Judas behavior. Most directly of skimming from the money bag. I think that's probably a quick one there.
I wasn't trying to say doing that with the LLC or the nonprofit is a sin or wrong. I was just pointing out that it's that's probably the closest in our modern day that we would have to a speaker that would do something like that. Might brag about not receiving money, but the reality is, well, yeah, you are, because what we did is we donated to this, and then you got money from there. That's all I meant there. I was parallel illustration.
Well, and that illustration then, though, even with the deception of those who do that, which is deception and is dishonest. If they can, I don't get paid, that's dishonesty there. But it ties into what's going to take place in verses 14 through 18, where he really then lays into that and talks about, did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you, talking about Titus and Timothy and others who would have had interaction with them? Because it does fit into that larger picture of he did send people to them, and they had a different relationship with those people than they did with Paul. It seems to be indicating that Timothy, Titus, those guys may have indeed been supported in that more culturally normal patronage context, where Paul wasn't, because he was working with his hands, and all of that bigger context of the culture of Corinth comes into play that we don't always see in the messages themselves. That I think is, to me, really interesting, but it also helps refine and define why Paul is pulling the levers the way he is. Because in his language and his message, he is pulling at the various points of conflict and towards the points of resolution. Terry?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, we're going to get into this section coming up. Probably should go ahead and get there, though, where he really uses this illustration of parent-children, right? And he uses that kind of as a defense. He even explains, hey, kids aren't supposed to pay off their parents. Parents are supposed to take care of their kids, kind of thing, which I think is pretty interesting, which goes, to what Edwin said about this idea of, in that culture, they wanted him to owe them. He's really saying, well, I shouldn't owe you. I'm your parent. I'm the father in this illustration. Which is interesting because that turns it on its head, right? Because what is it really saying? You owe me, in a sense, which is pretty interesting.
Unless everyone's got another great comment there, because all of his comments are great. Do you want to go ahead and read verses 14 through 18?
I have a question. I want to make sure we don't just sidestep it. What are the true signs of an apostle?
Well, at least in the text there, you could say 3 plus 1 would be the ones there: signs, wonders, and mighty works. Yep. But I think utmost patience is a component to it. I think there are the definitions of the application of those things, and the language-wise for there, the 3 words that are used in the very text itself. You've got signs. In reasoning, or a sign of reproof, most likely ties to Mark 16:20, stamp of validity, wonders, a marvel, something amazing take place, and a mighty work is a demonstration of the power of God, the dynamo effect, if you will. And so in the work of Paul, he's clearly demonstrating his capacity to do things extraordinary beyond his own physical capacity, either the passing on of spiritual gifts or the gifts themselves, which the book of Acts does show Paul being a vessel of service in that regard.
Is there another?
Which, by the way, I would say this, Edwin, I don't think the idea of apostleship is exclusive as I was often taught that it was. How about that as an answer? Because, basically we were always taught growing up in the church, there's only 13 of them. Like, that's it. There's only 13 of them. That Barnabas reference, that's not real kind of thing, right? So to kind of answer you there a little bit, I think it's more than we often acknowledge as far as that goes. And this text, I think, kind of opens that up a little broader for everybody than we normally think. How about that as an answer?
I got one more passage in a second.
Well, I think that's interesting. I know it's 11:36, and that means we have like 10 minutes, so I can't believe you just brought that one up.
Speed.
Yeah. But, I didn't. You did. I just followed through.
I think it's interesting that Paul's statement is not, hey, I'm one of the 12 plus Paul, so I'm obviously an apostle. There was some proof that had to be given. One of the things I've thought about on this one, 2 things. Number one, do you think that, what distinguishes between apostles and those upon whom the apostles had laid their hands is the fact that, as we saw in Samaria, it took an apostle to actually be able to pass on gifts. Where you remember Simon the sorcerer, he wanted that ability. He didn't just want gifts. He wanted the ability to have what the apostles had. And so I think there's something there that might get us toward signs of the true apostles, though I also believe that in Mark 16, there's some statements there that are applied to the apostles, and Paul is saying that has happened. Second thing, though, is it possible that there's another connection here to Moses? And that is that just like Moses gave some signs that false magicians and false powerful people, some were able to mimic, but they eventually got to a point that they couldn't. And Paul is highlighting this again. Okay, so your super apostles have been able to mimic some of this, but you guys were there. You have seen that the God working in and through me, because I'm weak. This is not me. This is the power of God. was above where they were, which then kind of takes us back to his rebuke against those false apostles for comparing themselves among themselves, because there's almost this hint of, hey, they're really not comparing themselves with me though. Because there's no comparison, just like Simon the sorcerer was no comparison to Philip when he came into town.
Yeah, and I think this is the last tie-in for that. I think there is a connection there, but this expands it to the Spaghe's use. It's very possible that in verse 12, the signs of a true apostle, the ESV does not capitalize that term, is talking more in terms of a messenger. And I indicate that because the same triad of ideas appears in Acts chapter 2, verse 22 to describe Jesus.
Yep.
If you're talking about what the true signs of a messenger, an approved ambassador for the Lord is, this is a generic stamp of approval idea rather than we can draw lots and replace the missing apostle, the missing close disciple. And so I think there's more of a generic use here than a specific use. Again, still accomplishing the same goal: real apostle, real ambassador, real actual apostle, etc. All of that's in play in the sense of the text. Are we ready to go forward, Edwin?
You've
got
absolutely.
The accelerator.
We have to ask for Edwin's permission to move on, I think. We tried twice, but we keep getting sidetracked by the thorn.
It's a third time. We're asking a thorn the third time to read ahead.
For the third time, I am ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden. Paul will not be a burden. For I seek not what is yours, but you. For children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? But granting that, I myself did not burden you. I was crafty, you say, and got the better of you by deceit. Did I take advantage of you through any of those whom I sent to you? I urged Titus to go and sent the brother with him. Did Titus take advantage of you? Did we not act in the same spirit? Did we not take the same steps? Have you been thinking all along that we have been defending ourselves to you? It is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your upbuilding, beloved. For I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish. That perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder. I fear that when I come again, my God may humble me before you, and I may have to mourn over many of those who sinned earlier and have not repented of the impurity, sexual immorality, and sensuality that they have practiced.
So again, this is like a pushing towards those culmination ideas. When you have the interlude verses 14 through 18, where Paul pulls on the dynamics of the relationship between Paul, Timothy, Titus, the church at Corinth, all of those relationships, they are still coming from the place of where Paul sees his connection to the brethren at Corinth, where he's looking at them and seeing them and saying, do you know how much I love you? Let me open my heart to you. How much do I care about you? I will most gladly be spend and be spent for your souls. It's that same illustration where he talks about himself later as being poured out as a drink offering. He's willing to give any ounce of himself toward their service. And that's when he has to come back to this last clause, to me at least, and say, are you thinking we're defending ourselves? That's not what we're doing. That's not what we're doing at all. So we've got 4 minutes, perfect amount of time to sum up 8-10 verses, because we've already spent and spending ourselves on the earlier part of the text. But what do you guys see here? What's the application for Paul? What's the application for the church at Corinth? And what's the application for us today?
Well, one of the interesting things is in chapter 7 when he talks about coming back. He talks about wanting it to be a good visit. He doesn't want it to be a difficult visit, and he has confidence that it will be. But now he comes to this point and he says, when he comes back, there's going to be these people involved. It's a pretty bad list, isn't it, in verse 20 and 21 when you read all these things? I mean, these are things we don't want to be involved in. And he's like, when I come back, I realize some of you are going to be still doing this stuff. And oddly enough, that same stuff is the stuff from the first letter, right? So he knows there's still going to be those people. I think one of the things that at least makes sense to me is that doesn't mean that he's changed his mind in chapter 7 that it's going to be a good visit. What it does mean is he's realizing that even though he wants to come back and he wants it to be more pleasant, there are still going to be people there that are still involved in the sins of their past that he's going to have to deal with. And I think one of the applications for Paul, for them, and for us is all this. There is no such thing as a perfect church. There's always going to be difficulty. There's always going to be situations that have to be dealt with. And even if you do the best that you can do, which no doubt Paul did, there's going to be problems that have to be addressed. And I think that's interesting to see. And I don't think this is in conflict with what he says in chapter 7 at all, but rather just kind of a fuller picture of, even though he wants it to be pleasant, he knows this stuff's still going to be there. And he's still going to have to deal with it when he comes. By the way, which I think ties into the father motif, right? It kind of reminds me of over in Thessalonians, where he talks about being a nurturing mother at times and also the sternness of a father. There is this point where he's using this father motif in this section. A father saves up for his kids, not kids for the father. And oh, by the way, when dad comes home, there's going to be some of you that are in trouble. So it's interesting to kind of see that thread go through these verses as well.
Edwin?
Way more than 2 minutes worth of stuff in these verses. As Paul is, I think he's finally reached his final salvo. He's been building and building and building and building and building to finally get to this point of, all right, guys, here's where the rubber hits the road. I'm coming back. And you know what? When I come back, you guys have been making all these complaints, but I'm not going to change the way I've been acting. When I come back again, I'm still not going to be a burden to you. And the reason I'm not going to be a burden to you is because I'm your daddy. And but there's some obligation when I'm your daddy.
So is this the "Who's your daddy" passage of Second?
Who's your daddy?
Is that what you're saying?
I mean, you know, he's because I am God's ambassador. I am the one who has authority over you. Remember, he had said earlier that he wasn't going to boast beyond the level of authority. But what was that authority given to him for? To build up. And so he comes back to that again, the upbuilding. He says, guys, I'm going to come back and I'm going to act the way I've been acting because it's the way I get to act. And you guys need to listen. Now, I don't want to come back and have to discipline you as a father disciplines children. Again, we've already had one of those painful visits. I don't want another one. But guys, if I have to come back and it has to be another painful visit, that's what I'm going to do. And the reason I'm going to do it is because I love you too much to let you linger like you are. These false apostles don't care about you. They will let you go to hell to get their reputation, to get what I'm not going to do that. I'm going to come in and I'm going to act as a father does and try to raise you and discipline you and help you grow and come to the Lord.
Yeah, I want to throw one more thing in there before Terry, if I could.
Yep.
Is to think about how we sometimes grapple with the humanity of Jesus. And where does that intersect with the spiritual, divine nature of Jesus? As we're getting these closing parts of chapter 12, I'm thinking about the humanity of Paul, the part where he stops as being a vessel to speak for God. And we think about his spiritual struggle as a human seeking righteousness. And verse 20, for I fear that perhaps when I come, I may find you not as I wish, and that you may find me not as you wish, isn't just a low order play on that relationship. It's also a little bit of concern as I think through it. Well, how will Paul respond to this? Is this going to incite spiritual rebellion on the inside of Paul? Is he going to struggle with his human behavior as he grapples with their spiritual condition? My general answer to that is yes, all those things are going to be pulled on the person that Paul is, because he's more than just the apostle. He's more than just Paul, the Jew who is now for Jesus. He's Paul, the person who's seeking to serve God. And I think there's a level of his heart opened up here too that is important for all of us to think about. It's like, this is going to be spiritually challenging to Paul when he goes there, as much as it is a discipline moment, because that's how it is with me when I'm in that role. And I think it's pretty easy for us to catch that too.
Yeah, I think the question is, what's he going to do? Like in verse 21 with these sins, what's he going to do with this? I think 1 Corinthians 5 already tells us what he's going to do. Although he's going to be in the flesh this time, he's going to be present rather than absent. He's going to still do the same thing. Which, as a father, I mean, all three of us are fathers, and all three of us have talked about it privately, especially Edwin and I have talked a lot of time about disciplining our kids. We don't like it, right? I mean, there's things we've had to do for our kids. We don't find any pleasure in it, but we know it's what's best for them. And I think that's part of this passage as well. It's kind of coming through is, look, hey, I don't want this to be a bad visit when you put chapter 7 this together, but you got to know when I come home, right? When I come home and you've not taken care of things, I will take care of things. I don't want to, and it's going to bother me to do it, but I will. And I'm going to kind of maybe close this off with this thought and tie it back to the do the work kind of thing. And we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago. This section of Scripture, especially for me, is something that really make an application for preachers. If you get into the idea of preaching that it's going to be this glamorous, no problem, no accusation, no criticism job or life that you have ahead of you, it's not really a job, you are mistaken. Because what you see here is not only the criticism Paul has received unfairly, and if Paul as an apostle can receive that criticism unfairly, you and I as non-apostles will as well. But beyond that, it also in turn makes us put ourselves in spaces and places that we have to respond in ways that aren't enjoyable at all, because we have to end up defending that. And that's the difficulty. And Phil and I and Edwin and I have all talked about this privately as well. I think one of the things that we need is we need more evangelists, but we need more evangelists that are willing to suffer. And our suffering is nowhere close to what we've read about in chapters 11 and 12. Nowhere close to what we've read about in these last 2 chapters of 2 Corinthians. And yet Paul continually defends himself, but also says in that defense, I don't want to defend myself because what I really want is for the Word of God and for Jesus to be seen here. And that's what's necessary. And so if you're in the work or you're thinking about doing the work, what you see in these 2 chapters is you will suffer as a part of the work. And you've got to be willing to endure that suffering for the cause of Christ in order to spread the gospel. That's just part of it. And I think that's one of the things that maybe we overlook from all of this.
Edwin?
I was tying it to some of the things you've talked about on your Do the Work series also, but what I was tying it to was that I think Paul wraps up here by reminding the Corinthians, I don't work for you.
Yeah.
And his point is not, I work for the other churches that supported me. I work for God. So preachers, evangelists, we work in tandem with elders and deacons. We work in tandem with congregations. We have certain roles that we are supposed to fill, and certainly we are to be held accountable by our brothers and sisters. We are to be shepherded by shepherds, just as everyone in a church is. We are not above and beyond God's will because we fill the role of evangelist or preacher. But at the end of the day, what I have to remember is God is my boss. And, there are things that maybe elders and churches need to remember about that. But what I have to remember is when it comes time to say the hard things, I have to be willing to put my paycheck on the line and say, I know some folks think I'm the employee because they give me a paycheck and they might hold over my head. You keep saying that and the paycheck is going to go away. I have to remember, I don't work for a paycheck. I work for God.
I'm glad you said that because everybody's tired of hearing me and Phil say that. So that's great.
Hey, Edwin, I want to thank you for being with us today, for joining in the study, especially because of the early entertainment. No, actually, because of your great comments. It was a wonderful look at the text, and we really appreciate it. Round the horn.
Thanks for the
quick.
opportunity.
Thanks. Terry, last shots?
So I just wanted to kind of send some prayers out to the Morris family. For those of you may have met in your lifetime, Bob Morris, who was an elder at Temple Terrace for a long time. He is a family member of ours through my wife's side of the family. He passed away this morning early. He was just a tremendous, tremendous encouragement to me as a young preacher, and as I grew older, continued so. And he was a great, great man, served as a shepherd there at Temple Terrace for a long time, and has sons who are elders and preachers and grandsons who are preachers, and he will be sorely missed, and just sending prayers their way and thinking about them this morning.
Edwin?
Well, going along the same lines as Terry, if we're wrapping up here with just what's on our hearts and minds, we've had a tragedy in our congregation last week. This time I received an email about one of our young mothers had died in her sleep. And Andrew Roberts, the other preacher here, and I are preparing even now for a memorial on Saturday for this family. Her parents are members of this congregation. Of course, her husband and children, 4 kids still at home, all under the age of 13. And so it's been a really, really tough week for all of us here. So certainly praying for it's the Welch family.
Yeah, I want to include myself in those requests for prayers in that regard, because there are so many mentors that have left over the last 6 months to a year of my life that every single edge of those families that you've mentioned is going to be different going forward. I want to add a request so that people think about the family members whose kids are far away from home. There's a number of kids that we all know who are separated from their parents, who are sick, not feeling well. Some of them have COVID. Some of them are struggling in spiritual ways as they've wandered far from their father's love and compassion, spiritually speaking. That praying for all of them is a good way to change the nature of a day. 2020 is dumb, but prayer is great. And I think we can leverage what God provides to us in good ways. Thanks, everybody. If we can serve you in some way, if Terry, Edwin, or I can answer any questions you have with the Bible or be an encouragement to you, please let us know. We'd